Well, let's make the most of the time. Gail, over to you.
Thanks ever so much, John. I'm wondering, do you want to share my PowerPoint? Is it easier for you to do at your end?
Yeah, we can do that.
Just in terms of screen sharing. It's great to be with you all this afternoon, and oh my gosh, isn't it absolutely boiling? I feel I'm gradually melting this afternoon, so there may not be anything left of me by the time we finish. So hopefully we can deal with high temperatures. As John said, we're exploring questions and our approach to doing church intergenerationally. And I just pose this question at the outset to let you just have a moment to think about, are you ready, and are the people and places that perhaps you work in, that you minister in, are they ready as well? And we recognise at the outset that all of us may find ourselves in different places. Some of us may find ourselves in churches and congregations that are very intergenerational, and there's lots of mixing across different ages, and in other places perhaps we're more multi-generational. So actually we may have different generations, but there isn't a great deal of work with everybody else. So it might sound okay, I'm a bit concerned that it isn't. I'm sounding like a Dalek.
You are sounding a little like a Dalek.
Okay, I'm going to try plugging my headphones in. It didn't like them much before, but I'll give it a go.
Oh, Susie, you can't hear anything. I'll message you directly and see if we can work things out.
You were sounding really good when you just plugged your headphones in. I don't quite know what that was about.
I'll put a little eye on the chat just in case. So our thinking about being intergenerational always begins with the people, and it begins with the people that we know, that we are working alongside. It begins with the people in our congregations, the people who take part in our groups, our activities, whatever those settings may look like, and often they are different everywhere. So as we're talking and reflecting, you will need to be bearing in mind your situation and your circumstances and the people that you know. And of course, those people will be at different stages of life. They will be at different stages of family life, for instance, and they will also be people who are of different ages and in different generations. And so we need to be working on our understanding of who they are and where they come from in the sense of their backgrounds, because we need to have a very clear sense of who we're working with, because that is how we then go about framing our work in helpful ways for all generations. So let me just say a little bit perhaps about myself, because I always find it helpful to have a sense perhaps of the person who's speaking to me and their credentials for talking about a particular topic. And so the roots of my own experience, I used to be a primary school teacher, and then I worked for 10 years at a church in Luton. And I was a part-time children's worker just at the brink, kind of at the start of the 2000s, where children's ministry was beginning to be something the church was interested in. We wanted to expand our Sunday schools and the work that we were doing with children, and we were also looking at how we engaged with schools as well. And so through that time, my role evolved, and so I became increasingly working across different ages, across different generations, so that I was working as family pastor in my role with that church. And one of the interesting things was that we did monthly, what we call generations services. And so this was our space to worship as all ages. It was a space where we were very intentional about wanting to bring everybody together. So it wasn't a children's service that the adults tolerated. It was a space for everyone. And we worked hard to make that a worshipping space where people of different ages could engage in it. And they were very creative times. And looking back now, I think hindsight, obviously, a very wonderful thing. I recognise that we did some very crazy, outrageous things at times. One of the occasions I remember that we sort of transformed our worship space into kind of the holy sort of ark and tent of God from the Old Testament. And we created spaces around that for people to come and meet with God and engage with him in very free-flowing ways, which perhaps aren't dissimilar to what we just experienced in that short time that John led us in. More recently, I have joined the all-age worship team of the church that we are now part of. So we go to an Anglican church, we go to our nearest church, it's at the top of our road. It takes us 5 minutes to walk there. Currently, even less because we're on Zoom. So within seconds, we can be with our church family. And that team has developed into being a digital worship team. And so we're now creating fortnightly services for people of all ages for half an hour on a Sunday morning, and we do that via Zoom, so it's all live, and with that all of the added technical elements of it and all of the challenges of trying to bring people together and be interactive and participatory when you are separated by a screen. And some things we're discovering work just the same as if we were in person, and some things are actually much more complex and difficult. And we're realising that it's actually very easy for people to be passive in those spaces. And so we want to encourage people to become more active, so there's a much stronger sense of us being an intergenerational community. So it's also important to be aware that there are going to be generational tensions. Perhaps that's the best way to describe it. And you may be aware within your church community that there may well be some distinct tensions that exist across people from different age brackets. So what do I mean by that? So, of course, it depends on how we were raised. It depends on what our expectations are of how people behave. It depends on what assumptions we bring and many of the things which we have perhaps grown up and developed in terms of our own values and our own understanding of life generally, but also specifically within a church community. It's very easy for us to misunderstand someone who perhaps is in a different age bracket to us. So I'm a Generation Xer. There are lots of things I recognise that I've inherited from previous generations. And so people who are in their 40s and maybe their early 50s are kind of have certain things about how we live and move and work, how we raise our children, for instance, that are specific to us. And when we start to look at, say, millennials or people who are in Generation Y, they will have different expectations and assumptions. And in between those generations, we can misunderstand one another. It happens very easily. And so it's helpful for us to be alert to those things. I'm especially aware that during this time when we've been experiencing a much more distanced life, actually, what is the impact going to look like for particularly our children in this time? And I think for our children, they will have seen life shifted enormously from just a few months ago. In conversation with my parents, they in lots of ways don't feel their life has changed very much. They're both retired. They feel that much of their daily routine has kind of continued in terms of spending a lot of time at home. But for children who aren't at school, for children who are staying distanced from their friends, they're having to come to terms with a new way of life where they are being told to keep apart from people. So as those children grow into teenagers and then adults, I wonder what they're going to be taking with them from this time, which will affect the rest of their lives in the way that they interact with people. Will they have become more reluctant to get closer to other people and socialise with them, for instance? Will we perhaps struggle in years to come for them to have a comfortable and safe sense of being in the company of others. It's really difficult to know the impact, obviously, of any of those things right now. I'll bring an example from our Zoom church experience. And this is our current digital church setting. And so some of it may not necessarily apply, but I think it does come from life before lockdown. So I've noticed that for some folk, they arrive 10 minutes before the Zoom starts. They are well dressed. They have pretty much got ready as they would for a usual physical church service. They sit quite formally in that space. They tend not to be moving around. They're quite still. And then I've noticed for other groups of people, and maybe for children and some of the families who are involved, they arrive at 10 o'clock on the dot. They may well be in their pajamas. They may be sitting eating their breakfast, some of them. They may be casually dressed and they're snuggled up on the sofa. They look much more kind of relaxed in each other's company. And some of those things are age differences, and some of those differences are simply because of the people that we are. But it tends to be a generational thing from what I can observe. And so I wonder if you are noticing any of those things, perhaps with the people that you know and work with. I'm sort of, I guess I'm middle-aged, so I'm somewhere in between. Part of me would actually really love to turn up to church in my pajamas. I can't quite bring myself to do it. And I don't know why that is. Something again about how I've been raised and my own expectations of what it is to be taking part and joining in a church service, perhaps. So I want to suggest to you this afternoon that there are 3 places that we can start. And I'm going to take us through each of those, and you're going to have a chance to have conversations with other people after each of these suggestions. And they are very much places to start. There is no expectation that any church would do all of these within the space of a few weeks and suddenly be extremely intergenerational. So let's begin with gathering together. And you'll see in a moment or two a few suggestions of what this may look like. So I think gathering together is an important part of the how of being intergenerational church. And actually it's really important for us to adapt the times that we gather, because there will be spaces within the life of church where we already get together. And so it's about looking at those times and thinking, how do we add meaning to those spaces where different aged people are in the same room? And we add meaning through nurturing mutual understanding. So we want to try to have a better understanding of one another's needs and preferences and where we're coming from. That's about building a sense of empathy for and with one another. It's about recognizing the other person won't always behave in the same ways or expect the same things that I do. And that's okay, because that's who they are, and I respect that. And it's also about recognizing that we are one body in Christ. And so when we come together, we recognize that we have all been made in the image of God. We look different, we believe different things, our theology is different, we have different views, but actually we are still the one body of Christ. And so how do we embrace that diversity? How do we operate in a way which is inclusive for everybody to be who they have been made to be? So when we gather together, we want to enhance those times. So we don't create new spaces to be intergenerational. We look at what we're already doing and we think, actually, how do we shape new ways of being with one another, which isn't about saying, look, here's a program, we're going to follow this to make us all intergenerational. It's actually about saying, look, let's enhance the times when we are already gathering as different generations and using that really effectively to generate that empathy and that understanding. So some time for you now to go out into breakout groups to reflect on this. Are there times where you're already doing this? Can you identify times when you might be able to use that for the benefit of everybody? John, do you want to put people into groups and let them know how long they've got perhaps as well? So just to recap a little bit about gathering together, it's about thinking about when those occasions happen in the life of church. I don't want us to feel bound by purely thinking about services. I want us to think about the breadth of church life and everything that kind of happens in between. And so some of those things may feel, actually there are people maybe on the who we might consider are more on the margins of church life, and it may not be a case of bringing everybody who's involved together, but it may be thinking about how do we in those different spaces encourage different ages to mix and get to know one another. I'm kind of aware, particularly say within a toddler group, that we're seeing more and more grandparents. If we think about sort of post-lockdown times and before lockdown, in a toddler group you might have childminders or grandparents or carers coming, and so actually when we've got those different ages together, what does that space look like as we gather? How are we creating empathy and understanding? I think sometimes one of my reflections would be that grandparents would maybe have a different expectation in terms of children's behaviour, and so how are we helping everybody to kind of understand what those different things are? I think that's worth giving some time to. This whole area of intergenerational church is about creating an environment where people feel that they belong. And I would describe that, I was trying to think of a phrase that might describe this, and the best thing I could come up with was a sense of a divine greenhouse, where the conditions are right for different generations to grow and flourish. And so let's move on to look at the next point. So this is about how we go about building relationships, which is part of what we do to create greater empathy between different ages. This is about creating conversations that will deepen friendships, which will take us from superficial knowledge of one another into a sense of friendship and knowing of each other. It's about offering different connections and possibilities that we might be able to make for people to be family for one another. So we have family in the biological sense, but we also in the 21st century have many more occasions where families happen beyond those blood ties between people. And so if we're thinking about people who are single, if we're thinking about people who have maybe their family are elsewhere in the country, if we're thinking about perhaps young adults who are in a certain place because of study or work, how can we help those people to build ties with older and younger folk so they have that sense of being part of a family? And so we have those conversations, we have occasions where we socialise, we have fun together, and we break down some of those barriers, and we recognise that there are barriers between us when we're socialising. There have been some different and interesting projects that have happened. Generations Together in Scotland, who were very intentional about doing this, hosted a Generations quiz. And actually there were different rounds in that quiz that people of different ages took part in. They had people of different ages working together, helping each other. And through doing that, they tried to break some of those tensions and some of those barriers down. And it was really effective, a really effective way of doing that. It's also about serving alongside one another. So often we can try and perhaps force people into having conversations. That may be a little bit awkward. An older person may feel unsure about how to talk to a child or a young person. They may feel that they're not going to necessarily understand or be able to make the connections that are needed. And so sometimes if we're involved in a joint activity, that can be a brilliant way to build relationships, because actually in the course of doing something together, working together on a task, we build up some understanding. Now, there was a story that Rachel Turner told me about a church where she was serving and working, where they created teams in their church of different ages that worked on different things. Now, they obviously had safeguarding conversations around these things. So let's assume that that is something that has taken place. And so in different aspects of church life, you had children, young people and adults working together, helping each other. And in this one particular example, she was saying about an older man who had a younger man who he worked with. And on a couple of occasions, he realized that the young man hadn't shown up, that he wasn't there, and he was concerned for him. And because of the nature of how their relationship had grown, that man was able to get in touch with the younger man and ask how he was and if things were okay and what was going on in his life. And they had built over time, because they were working regularly with one another to do this job, they had built some relationship, which meant that there was a level of concern for each other. And the older man was able to use his initiative to build up some contacts and some friendship there. Now, it's the point of sharing that with you is to say that actually, if there had been a structured mentoring program, so say for instance a church said, look, we want to make sure that you are to know people of different ages, so we're going to make you mentor somebody, we're going to put you into these mentoring relationships, this is who you're going to be with, you've got to meet each other for an hour in a week and talk to each other. I would imagine that a lot of people would probably duck out of doing it, would feel very afraid and worried, and the take up on it would be very limited. But actually, in a much kind of softer way, that's what these opportunities were in their church. They were mentoring younger people and older folk together, but through doing a task with each other. And it was a much more effective way of doing that than perhaps making it into something which felt much more structured, that for some people would not have worked quite so effectively. So I wonder for you, where you are, where are those opportunities for people of different ages to get alongside and work jointly on something? Now, it could be a big thing. It may be a very small thing. It may be a short-term project. It might be something that's just over a few weeks. It might be something that's over a few months. Let's not assume that these types of things have to continue forever and a day. And I think for some people, they feel daunted by committing themselves. So sometimes if it's a short-term thing, that can make it much easier. Sometimes it might be about finding an issue that people have in common. They want to act on it. They want to respond to an issue. So how can we help them to get together and facilitate that so that they can work out how they would like to respond? Side-by-side working can really build relationships very powerfully, because it's a byproduct of everything that's involved in terms of the other things that we may be doing in that task. That's often the case, and I think particularly it's been shown with young people that side-by-side, physical side-by-side conversations can be more powerful than face-to-face. Face-to-face is often too intimidating for some people. It was commented to me actually about some of the stress that's involved in being engaged in Zoom meetings and Zoom gatherings, because it means looking face to face very much. And I've been learning over these past few months that it's perfectly okay for me to look away, to look out of a window, to look at the floor, to not always be making eye-to-eye contact, and that we need to feel able to do that with one another. And that's perfectly acceptable, because it makes it slightly less stressful perhaps. We might need to use a few tools to do this. I talk sometimes about needing to oil the cogs of relationships if they don't feel like they are naturally happening or easy. So something like the Table Talk resource, which has all those questions in, can we get that out? Can we give out questions to everybody? Can they then spend 2 minutes answering somebody else's question? And then we can just hear some very light-hearted responses. Can we hear some maybe more profound responses? We may need to think about which edition we're using, or the types of questions that we're choosing, but that can really help us to build relationships. We want to really think about how we are doing small things over time, because their impact builds up. So we don't do a big necessarily, I mean, you might be the kind of church that would love this. We don't necessarily do a whole big get to know one another day where there's lots of opportunities to be doing this. Let's think about those few minutes that we can be using our time to build relationships, which happen in both directions. So it's not just about older people getting to know younger people, but it's about vice versa. It's about everybody knowing each other. Thanks so much for that, John. That's amazing. Super speedy. So we have to recalibrate our mindset in a way, because it's not about a doing to, it's about becoming more intentional about doing with, about coming alongside as different age people who have equal contributions to make. So let's go back out into groups. John has thankfully shared the link to Table Talk there. That would be a great investment if you wanted to purchase something that would help you. John, perhaps after this we would come back and then we'll go into a short break.
Would anybody like to share some of the reflections you've had in your groups, things that you kind of thought, oh, that was really helpful? You can unmute yourself and speak, that'd be lovely.
And do so in just a sentence if you can, folks.
Okay, so we were just saying that some of us were, or actually we were all doing the right kind of things, but we've come to the conclusion that the wider church don't necessarily want to engage in some of the intergenerational stuff that we're trying to do. So we need to make them feel as if they might be missing something.
Yeah. Yeah. I was sharing a story that Gail unwittingly made happen a few years ago. Gail came and videoed a service in our church, and then she did some vox pops afterwards of people's reflections and whatever. And one of the people she interviewed had campaigned against all age worship for all of my time in the church. And yet on this occasion, somehow Gail managed to get him to say something really, really super duper positive about how important it was and it should never go back. And I can't tell you how much I jigged around my front room. It is culture change that needs to happen somewhere in there. It's in ethos. It's a way, and I like that idea of making them realise they're missing out rather than, yeah. I don't know how you do that. We offered bacon and eggs and croissants, so maybe that's food. Anybody else before I keep going?
We mentioned about it's not just the other church goers, it's the ministers and the worship leaders. They've been doing the same thing for years and years and years, and to get them sometimes to change, because they're worried about upsetting certain people, you know what I mean? It's really hard for them, I know that. But, you know, sometimes you lose things and you gain things, and how we get people to think differently on services, it's a really hard thing to do, I think.
Yeah. I would think maybe a pattern of maybe doing one without doing them all, so that you get short-term buy-in and then see where that goes. Claire, sorry, you put your hand up.
I think I really like the first 2 points about gathering together and building relationships. And our church is planning to do some kind of messy church cafe style service straight away. But I think actually we're missing that. It's important to build those relationships for people to do things together. And we also talked about understanding, as we've seen, there's very different understanding in the generations about worship. A lot of the older people are very much, it is stand up, sit down, hymn sandwich worship. And it's about getting them to understand that the younger generation just don't do that. You know, and even in school, we don't do that. And this works better for them. And it's trying to get that interaction. But as someone else said, it's about realising there's something in it for the older people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'm just slightly conscious of the time. So has anybody else got a... going to sound like an auctioneer now. Going, gone. Yeah, there's loads in that, and it's been really, really helpful, Gail. Thank you very much for coming and sharing that today. If you didn't know, Gail has written this wonderful book called The Essential Guide to Family Ministry. It's available on various websites. There it is. So you can get a copy of that, and there's a whole chapter on intergenerational stuff in there for you to kind of work your way through. So highly recommend that book.